Chants of death to Arabs. Anger and hate has spilled out onto the streets in the coastal city of Bat Yam. Palestinian Israelis and Jewish Israelis living in close proximity, turning on each other. Among many violent incidents, on Wednesday a Palestinian man was dragged from his car by dozens of Jewish Israelis, who continued to beat him even after he lost consciousness. The video is broadcast live on Israeli television. And closer to Tel Aviv, Palestinian businesses were ransacked. The wave of violence has hit dozens of cities and regions across Israel. It's the worst between communities living alongside each other in decades. Israeli officials say they are more violent than the protests that led to the Al-Aqsa Intifada in 2000. Tension came to a boiling point as a court prepared to rule on the forced expulsion of Palestinian families from their homes in the occupied East Jerusalem Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Israeli journalist Yossi Melman says he's worried about vigilante groups inside Israel running amok. He says they're headed to the abyss as a result of absence of governance and years of incitement. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has asked both sides to stop the attacks. In an attempt to quell the violence, Netanyahu ordered the emergency deployment of border forces. But police tactics are under scrutiny after this video was shared on social media of officers storming a family home in the northern city of Haifa. They can be seen beating an unarmed Palestinian Israeli man. And to the south of Tel Aviv, the city of Lod has been put under a state of emergency, the first in an Arab community since 1966. It's been one of the worst hit by riots. On Tuesday night, Jewish cars and a synagogue were set alight. A mosque was burned the next day. And Palestinian Musa Hassouna was shot dead by Jewish residents during protests. Even though the court has postponed the hearing on Sheikh Jarrah, many are now more worried about how to stop the violence caused by anger that's been simmering for much longer. Laura Bowden-Manley, Al Jazeera.
Well, Mickey Rosenfeld is Israel's police national spokesman to foreign media, joins us now from West Jerusalem. Good to have you with us. So the latest tension started with fears, concern that Israeli police might uphold an Israeli court order and forcibly evict Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, as well as actions, administrative and security measures taken by Israel in East Jerusalem around the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. My question to you, though, sir, do you accept that you are an occupying power, which this is according to the UN, you are an occupying power which has no legal authority to impose Israeli law in these occupied territories?
Israel and the country that we live in is a country that belongs to the Jewish people with a history of thousands of years back. Israel and the different units, and I'm referring to the IDF and the Israeli National Police, will do everything possible in order to maintain public order and prevent large-scale incidents from taking place in Jerusalem. If we look back just last year when we were dealing here in Israel with COVID-19, Ramadan was very peaceful and very calm and quiet last year.
Okay, if I could jump in
this
then,
year, over the last 2
forgive
weeks,
me, but then what you're telling viewers is people like the official spokesperson, Rupert Colville, for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, when he said on May the 7th, 2021, and I quote, "Given the disturbing scenes in Sheikh Jarrah over the past few days, we wish to emphasize that East Jerusalem remains part of the occupied Palestinian territory in which international humanitarian law applies, and the occupying power must respect, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force in the country." You're saying to viewers that, in fact, he's wrong, because, as you said, this is your country. You don't recognize that you're an occupation.
what I'm saying is we're not an occupied force. This country belongs to Israel. Israel is a strong, unique and humanitarian country. At the moment, you've taken out of proportion the Israeli Arabs, unfortunately, within inside Jerusalem, have taken out of proportion a dispute about Sheikh Jarrah. There are many disputes that take place in many different areas, but they can be solved by the Israeli courts. Whatever the Israeli courts will decide will be accepted both by the Jewish families that live there as well as by the Israeli Palestinian families that live there as well. I'm going back to the point that we made, which what happened just 2 weeks ago on the Temple Mount. Thousands of Palestinians arrived there, and instead of celebrating, they gathered rocks and stones and attacked our police officers and Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall. That is something that is unacceptable. As a response, our police units went inside the Temple Mount area, only used non-lethal weapons and dispersed that riot. That is something that we've dealt with many times.
You have jumped in many times. If you let me jump in, but UNESCO says on point 5 of its May the 2nd, 2017 ruling that, quote, legislative and administrative measures and actions taken by Israel, the occupying power, it says, are especially, it says in particular, quote, the basic law in Jerusalem, are null and void and must be rescinded forthwith. Do you recognize that it's because of your interventions in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in East Jerusalem that is provoking the reaction from the Palestinians you're complaining about? Do you recognize that?
I have to confirm and make it clear to your viewers as well. The issue of the Temple Mount, the status quo will be kept and held and will continue by Israel. There's coordination.
So that's not my
which
question.
is made
My question
by Israel.
Is UNESCO wrong in saying that your attempts to enforce the basic law in Jerusalem and intervene in, as you call it, Temple Mount, and Palestinians call it the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, are null and void? Do you recognize that, yes or no?
My answer, I will answer you, and my answer is that the Israeli National Police and the Israeli government is making sure that the status quo on the Temple Mount will continue. This is one of the issues that we're dealing with. People are praying on the Temple Mount, and I'm talking about Muslims, 5 times a day in peace and quiet in a respectable manner.
So
Jews
you're not really answering the question about whether you recognize what UN organizations are saying. Let me quote to you then instead what Human Rights Watch has said in its report of June 4th, 2017. Israeli authorities have since 1967 facilitated the transfer of civilians to the occupied West Bank. Do you accept what UN organizations, what human rights organizations are saying? You are an occupying power that is violating international law.
I can see that you've gathered and put together all the quotes. The point is you and people have to understand and realize you're not talking and interviewing me in 1967. We're talking about 2021.
Sir, I've quoted to you quotes from Rupert Colville in May the 7th, 2021, and I have done my research and I make no apology for it. These need to be addressed.
That's okay, I understand that.
Are you saying to viewers, the UN, UNESCO, Amnesty International, I've got a quote here if you want to hear it, where they say settling civilians in occupied territories violates international humanitarian law and amounts to a war crime. Are you telling viewers the UN, the International Court of Justice, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch are all wrong and only you are right?
I'm saying, no, what I'm saying is that Jerusalem is not occupied.
Hang on, so you said no. If they're not wrong, then you admit that you are an occupying power that is violating international law by your interventions.
I heard your question, and I will answer your question now. Israel is in charge and is responsible and is making decisions as to what takes place here in Jerusalem, both West and East Jerusalem, together in the different neighborhoods and the different areas. Israel is fully in control of dealing with everything in terms of security. Israel is protecting the Israeli Jewish citizens as well as Israeli Arabs who are living in the different areas and the neighborhoods. Our responsibility is also to protect, to make sure that there are no frictions between the different sides, the different communities. I'm going back to a very important point, which is a sensitive point, which is what happened on the Temple Mount. We saw thousands of Palestinians taking the law into their own hands and attacking officers and attacking other areas. That is something that is unacceptable. And the Israeli police officers in and around who are guarding the 3 most holiest sites, the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, and the Church of the Sepulchre, are making sure that we're doing everything to prevent large-scale incidents.
Right,
We'll
you're describing to me, sir,
we'll
what you're doing. I don't think you've really addressed the point and the question I've put to you of whether you recognise what these organisations are saying, that what you're doing is taking the law into your own hands. But I'm afraid we are out of time. Thank you very much for explaining your perspective. We'll leave it to the viewers to draw their conclusions.
Thank you.